Good morning, friends. Welcome back to As a Man Thinketh on Yanasa TV. The 4th of July week was one of a lot of flooding for a lot of us. And while many of us are recovering, some of us appreciated the end of a drought. For others, it was absolutely devastating. What happened down in Texas was extremely horrifying. I have seen a lot of disasters in my lifetime. I grew up in Florida where we had experiences like Hurricane Matthew, but to hear about the number of children that were lost in the flooding in Texas was absolutely devastating to me. I don't even know, as a father who sends his kids to summer camp, what I would do in that situation. It was very sobering. And because of that, I had written a couple articles as we were kind of preparing for our own tropical storm here about what was going on in Texas. And I followed the story and posted updates about it to our Substack. Now, those stories were posted for free for those who are free subscribers. And the reason why I do that is because I feel like in situations like these, we need to pay very close attention to what led up to them, to make better choices going into the future so that this never happens again. And I know that you can't say it never will, but I certainly think that what happened in Texas, there were a lot of things that could have been done differently, that should have been done differently to avert this particular crisis. The only way we get to that is by looking back at it, having the conversation. And I believe that independent journalism, because it's not fulfilling a narrative, because it's just looking for information and sharing that information, you do get a different perspective, one that's not controlled by a handful of people that are sending out narratives to local stations across the country. I did face some criticism for publishing those articles as if I was trying to make money off of it. I don't make money off of free articles posted to Substack. But the reason why I did it is because I was horrified of what happened, and I wanted people to talk about it. And in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the points that I have made, some of the things that have come up, and hopefully we don't let this experience go by as just another tragedy. Hopefully we look at these things and we recognize what's going on, the pattern that needs to change. At this point in time, over 100 lives have been lost in the floods in Texas. These floods weren't as widespread as they were in Hurricane Helene here in North Carolina. They were very focused on a particular area, but what had happened is the river rose 27 feet in less than 45 minutes. People had less than 15 minutes to react. For some people, that's hard to imagine. But I could tell you, sitting through numerous tropical storms, even here on our property, we live on the top of a hill. For the first several hours of a storm, normally, the water soaks into the earth. We don't see a whole lot of runoff. But as that progresses, usually within the last few hours of the storm, it becomes so saturated that even on the top of a hill, we start seeing rivers and massive pools of puddles. And all of that water is running downhill. We live in a rocky soil environment with a lot of clay. Once it gets saturated, that water has nowhere to go but downhill. And when it starts moving fast. We see feet of water running off the top of our hill downhill. That feet of water is being accumulated with tons of water from everywhere else, and it's eventually making its way down to our local river, which we have seen that river flood tremendously, especially after Hurricane Florence. Hydrology is the big thing to understand here. And so when I talk about one of these points, which has to do with weather modification, it's not a conspiracy theory, but it is based on scientific evidence and scientific arguments of how just a couple inches of rain could make a massive difference in a flooding situation. Because even in the storms that we see here, where we get 5, 6, 8, 10 inches of rain, it's always the last few inches that cause the massive amount of flooding. And in some cases, if we've had a lot of rain leading up to an event, when the ground is already saturated with too much water, we can see a lot of flooding with just a few inches of rain from a storm that follows. One of the first things, though, that I want to touch on, and this is something that I wrote an article on the other day, is the alert system and the warnings going into the floods. We all get warnings on our cell phones. Now, I'm not sure, what the reception is in the areas where the floods occurred, assuming down along riverbanks, a lot of campgrounds. I know that when we are traveling, I don't necessarily have the greatest reception in the places I like to go to vacation. Oftentimes, if people aren't on the Wi-Fi, if they don't have a cell phone service for the area that they're visiting, these notifications are useless. But even then, from what I have read, the National Weather Service and the local meteorologists were not expecting the extent of the rain and the flooding the way that it kind of turned out. If you look at how this storm developed and how it paused and redeveloped over this area, it was quite odd. It's not something that a lot of forecasters were forecasting. That doesn't change the fact that this was a perfect setup for the storm. This storm formed with an extremely unstable laden of moisture drawdown from the Gulf of Mexico. The precipitable water values exceeded 2.3 inches above what we typically see in this region in July. There was a weak frontal value over the hill country of Texas, which caused the storm to stall. And during the stalling, you get a lot of lift, which caused a lot of these storms to just randomly pop up and develop. And this is something that I've seen a lot on radar recently, is these convective storms that just keep popping up in certain areas, and a lot of times they have a lot of heavy rain. When these convective storms popped up, there was very little steering winds in the upper atmosphere to move them along, so they became rather stationary right above the Guadalupe River. The CAP values were anywhere from 2,500 to 3,500, which is really, really unstable. And radar even indicated cloud tops exceeding 50,000 feet. So from the get-go, this storm was essentially kind of the perfect storm of circumstances. And like I said, a lot of people didn't see the extent of it coming. As far as the early warning systems, as far as the flash flood warnings, they were there, but they didn't know how bad it was going to be. They didn't know how bad it was going to get. They didn't have all of the information. So I think that had, a lot of people confused. I think they felt like the warning system had failed them. The conventional warning system was there, but it only gave people about 15 minutes of a heads up. And you see that a lot too. We see these storms moving into areas. Often we've been, even in the recent storm we were inundated. We were starting to flood by the time we actually got flash flood warnings in our area. But I knew it was coming. I understand our area. But what's bothersome about this is, the topography of the area, the hydrology of the area had early warning signs of a flood event like this coming at some point in time. It wasn't unforeseen. Back in 2016 and through 2018, the Kerr County officials had actually tried to work towards grants to getting a siren system installed along the river that would allow them to have a better way of communicating with people in the event that something like this happened, because they knew that it could happen, they knew that it eventually would happen, and that's why they wanted a siren system installed. They applied for grants from the state management authority that helps with local funding for emergency management, and they were turned down on that grant. So they actually made the attempt to install some sort of alert system, knowing that this was an area that could flood fast and quick. 27 feet in 45 minutes is extremely quick. And they knew that they had to have a different type of alert system put in place, other than the cell phone notifications that go out, other than news broadcast and meteorological reports. They needed something that was going to go out quickly. But even though their grants got turned down, in 2021, according to meeting minutes, they identified $50,000, had an engineer put together a system with that $50,000 that would have worked. They could have implemented their own funds that they had found within their budget to put in this siren system. But that's the last we ever heard about it. You didn't hear about them putting out bids for it, nothing like that. They never implemented the funds to put in this alert system. So to say that officials didn't fail in this situation, I think is a little short-sighted. They knew that this was a risk. They knew that people's lives were at risk to the point that they had to put sirens in along the river. They failed to get a grant. The state failed them in granting the funds. Now, what's funny about this is that The state of Texas, the federal government have granted funds to all sorts of projects, from solar farms to artificial intelligence. They support a ton of projects, but they didn't want to support this life-saving infrastructure project. Even then, Kerr officials still identified at least $50,000 that could have put in some sort of system in place that would have saved more lives. They still didn't implement it. I don't know why. Can't answer that question for them. Maybe the $50,000 really wasn't there. Maybe they really couldn't expense that money. But it doesn't change the fact that both state and local officials knew that this was a risk, and the decisions to move forward on prioritizing that over all the other things we give money to failed. They didn't do it. I'd be willing to bet that after this event, you do see an emergency siren system put in along this river. It should be put in along, numerous different rivers where there are people and structures and things in areas that could get flooded, even if it's a once-in-a-lifetime flood. Hopefully this is a once-in-a-lifetime flood. I don't ever want to see a tragedy like this again. Like I said, my heart was absolutely broken when I read about all those girls at that summer camp. And being a dad, it is absolutely horrific what happened there. So you have this perfect storm coming in. You don't have an adequate alert system for something like this, where the water's rising 27 feet in 45 minutes. People had 15 minutes of reaction time. I read a post about one of the campgrounds there. The campground owners actually walked down to the river at 2:30 in the morning when they got the flash flood warning, called the sheriff's department, tried to get more information on it. At that time, everything looked fine to them. An hour later, suddenly there are rescue teams waking them up. They've got campers floating away. It rose super quick. It rose so fast, and they didn't even know they were asleep. People were in those campers asleep. Sirens would have woken them up. Campers were in their bunk beds asleep. I can't even fathom the horror of this situation there. One of the bigger questions that I think has come out of this, and this is where I want people to open their minds and not lean towards, oh, this is a conspiracy theory. It's not I'm not saying that there's a conspiracy behind this. What I'm saying is that there is a real identification here of a problem that needs to be regulated, needs to be controlled, or just wiped out altogether. I mean, if this didn't occur, it wouldn't even be a question. People wouldn't even be talking about it. We have, as mankind, dealt with droughts, dealt with weather for thousands of years, hundreds of years. We've survived. We've made places work. Nature has made things work. Nature has areas that are drought resistant, areas that are arid, areas that are replenished. Nature is phenomenal when it comes to maintaining our earth, and mankind has always dealt with that. We've never had to control it. The state of Texas is involved in one of the largest weather controlling programs in the United States. It is unregulated federally, very loosely regulated at the state level. A lot of water management districts will actually approve cloud seeding to increase water. And I'm going to do a separate video on what's going on with water in Texas. In this video, I am going to talk about one of the critical needs of water in this area and why I think that this narrative is partly chilled and shut down, why people aren't allowed to talk about it, while people who do talk about it are constantly pointed fingers at as conspiracy theorists. Now, what we know is that in this area, weather manipulation was occurring. Cloud seeding was occurring. This isn't a phantom thing. This actually happens. It happens supposedly in the name of agriculture, although you'll find that a lot of ranchers and farmers constantly complain about cloud seeding because it contaminates the soil. The chemicals that they're spraying to seed the clouds aren't necessarily good for growing things or grazing animals on. There have actually been a lot of reports of how much this contamination actually impacts our food supply. So this isn't theory, this isn't speculation, this is actually what is going on in the state of Texas. The reason why they seed the clouds has less to do with agriculture and more to do with the water shortfalls in Texas in general. The municipalities need the water. That's why you have water districts implementing these practices, subcontracting with private organizations to seed the clouds, make it rain some more. They need the water. They need the water for their cities. They need the water to pipe halfway across Texas. They need the water along the I-35 corridor where they're building massive data centers. They need the water. So the water management divisions are the ones who are actually overseeing these programs, who are actually implementing a lot of these programs through private contractors. One of those private contractors, Rainmaker, admitted that they had been doing seeding activities around July 2nd, but they said that they had stopped because they had looked at the weather reports and determined that the system that was moving into the area was highly unstable.
So did weather modification operations play a part in Kerrville and the surrounding area? Doc Pete Chambers, who we want to give a special thanks to, by the way. You would remember we interviewed him just last week. He's running for governor of Texas, and on Independence Day, while most people were celebrating, he dropped everything to go and help the residents of Kerrville. So a huge thank you to him and his tireless work. But Doc Pete Chambers put out a call over the weekend, which has been viewed over 2 million times now, asking people to look into who was responsible for this and when was the last cloud seeding. You can see from the images he attached to that post that there is a NOAA form on file for a rain enhancement and hail suppression project with Rainmaker. That spans from the 15th of March 2025 to the 31st of October 2025 for Trans-Pecos. You can see the map attached to that form here, some of the operations detailed here, and another image which shows the Kerrville area affected. Now, this in from Zero Hedge writing on the article. They've included a portion about Rainmaker, the company that we told you about before, where that form was filed with NOAA. Intense scrutiny has obviously fallen on Rainmaker Technology, a California-based weather modification startup, amid speculation that cloud seeding may have contributed to the flooding. Augusto Dorico, which is the CEO of Rainmaker Technology, has said, the natural disaster in the Texan Hill Country is a tragedy. My prayers are with Texas. Rainmaker did not operate in the affected area on the 3rd or 4th or contribute to the floods that occurred over the region. However, Rainmaker did operate earlier in the week. So he continued. Overnight from July 3rd to 4th, moisture surged into the hill country from the Pacific as remnants of Tropical Storm Barry moved across the region. At 1 a.m. on July 4th, the National Weather Service, which we work closely with to maintain awareness of severe weather systems, issued a flash flood warning for San Angelo, Texas. Note, summer convective cloud seeding operations in Texas do not occur during overnight hours. At 4 a.m. on July 4, the National Weather Service issued a life-threatening emergency warning and flooding ensued. Did Rainmaker conduct any operations that could have impacted the floods? He says no. The last seeding mission prior to the July 4th event was during the early afternoon of July 2nd, so just 2 days prior, when a brief cloud seeding mission was flown over the eastern portions of south central Texas and 2 clouds were seeded. These clouds persisted for about 2 hours after seeding before dissipating between 3 and 4 p.m. Natural clouds typically have lifespans of 30 minutes to a few hours at most, with even the most persistent storm systems rarely maintaining the same cloud structure for more than 12 to 8 hours. The clouds that were seeded on July 2nd dissipated over 24 hours prior to the developing storm complex that would produce the flooding rainfall. A senior meteorologist observed an unusually high moisture content prior to the event's arrival using NWS sounding data. It was at this point that our meteorologist determined that we would suspend future operations indefinitely. As you can see, we suspended operations on July 2nd, a day before the NWS issued any flood warning. Here are the flight logs for July from our South Texas program.
Whether or not that's true, I don't know. It doesn't matter if it is or not, because if you look at the overall situation and what unfolded and what happened with this particular system, it still makes you question whether or not that our desire to modify the weather may have intensified the problem. Not putting blame on this particular company. I'm just simply drawing up the question of whether or not, because this is such an unregulated industry, because it's something that people aren't allowed to talk about without becoming conspiracy theorists, if the questions, the scientific questions that have been brought up and torn down by mass media, torn down by officials, whether or not those questions, if investigated, could actually reveal a little bit about what happened here. And I have a feeling that in the long run, we are going to look back on this particular situation as a case study. As this debate unfolds, I have a feeling that this will end up being a case study.
Even those allegedly targeted operations can and often do go so wrong. You may recall the catastrophic floods in Dubai last year. We just mentioned them in the interview with Gary. Despite the media's best efforts, it was widely known at the time that these floods were a direct result of cloud seeding gone wrong.
And I think it's important that we talk about these things in the wake of these tragedies so that we can understand how maybe our involvement as human beings could have played a role better or worse in the situation. According to a lot of studies, and this isn't just coming off the top of my head, according to a lot of different studies, and different countries have actually reported that they have seen as much as a 30% or more increase in rainfall due to cloud seeding operations. Typically, though, what you'll see is about a 5 to 15% increase in rainfall from cloud seeding operations. It is effective. It does work. When you seed the clouds, it does make it rain more. It's typically short-lived, but it makes it rain more. Now, I say typically because there are other questions about this that I think may have played a role in what we saw down in Texas. But the point is that even a 15 to 30% increase, because this would have been a perfect storm. So if it was directly seeded, a 15 to 30% increase would have increased the amount of rainfall in that area by several inches, which would have been the difference between a flood that just hit the banks and the flood zones and a flood that went over. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't take much. It just takes a couple inches. It takes a couple inches in the ideal circumstance, and this storm was the ideal circumstance. But as I said, the reports of what's been reported say that they stopped cloud seeding on the 2nd, and they didn't proceed. The storm happened on the 4th, the night of the 4th into the 5th. With all the different arguments made against weather manipulation and cloud seeding, including stealing water from other areas because you're making it rain in a certain area, therefore it's not raining in another. There's a lot of arguments that can be made about it. One of the ones that is most overlooked is probably the feedback cycles, the regional feedback cycles of a climate loop that can occur from cloud seeding operations. When this storm came into this area, it didn't come into an area that hadn't seen artificially increased precipitation within the last week or so. Artificial precipitation had been occurring just a couple days prior, which means that there was increased humidity, evaporation. There are a lot of things that can feed back into what we call a climate loop or a climate cycle, a feedback. It also means that some of the soil in the area was already somewhat saturated. There are all factors that play into it. You don't have to directly seed the storm itself to have had an impact on the flooding by doing routine cloud seeding days prior. In my report, I got into a lot of the specifics of the evaporation cycle and how it impacts future storms moving into the area. And these are all scientifically researched topics that people have talked about, people have some evidence of. So I don't think that we should write it off. I don't think that people should look at it and say, oh, well, that's a conspiracy theory. My question, though, is, when you look at these programs, why are billionaires funding these cloud seeding operations? What interest do they have? Are they trying to save the farmers that don't want the chemicals in their fields? Why is it that we have private interests from mega billionaires funding planes to fly above us, dispersing chemicals into the clouds to make it rain more? What interests do they have? Why would they do that? Is it truly an interest that is for the betterment of humanity, or is there an investment game involved? Now, I mentioned the I-35 corridor where there's a lot of data centers being built. And I also mentioned that I'm going to be doing another video on the water wars of Texas, because this is actually a very big and interesting topic that deserves kind of an in-depth analysis. And I don't want to take away from this video and recognizing the tragedy that occurred. But one of the main benefactors of cloud seeding in the state of Texas is artificial intelligence data centers, the infrastructure that it takes to be able to grow this massive technology play that Texas is trying to make. When you wonder who's investing in this stuff and why they're investing in it, it's not, like I said, just agriculture. A lot of agriculturalists don't like it. It has a lot more to do with these municipalities needing water for more development and more rural expansion, and this massive new need for data centers, for artificial intelligence rollout, for the technology boom that we're in. Why not make that technology boom accelerate by using technology to modify the weather, to supply all the needs that it needs. Which brings us back to the bigger question, you know, is it ludicrous for us to chase this artificial intelligence dream? Is it causing us to not only use up all of our natural resources and other resources, but is it causing us to maybe put ourselves in situations that could harm others inadvertently? I mean, I don't think anybody would have done this on purpose. Who in their mind would have done this on purpose? I don't think that's what happened. The people that were destroyed here weren't homeowners. And I mean, there were property owners, there were farms, there were things like that. The people who were destroyed here were campers, were vacationers, people who had come to the Guadalupe River for the 4th of July to celebrate their independence. I don't think that anybody did anything intentionally. And I do think that without proper research, without proper investigation and feedback cycles and everything else when it comes to cloud seeding, that any cloud seeding company would have done it intentionally, or if they had all of the information, if they had all of the regulations, they probably wouldn't have done it 2 days prior to the storm. I mean, there's a lot of, from the regulations that are on the table, they're not allowed to do it at night, which is when the storm occurred. They're not allowed to do it when there is a massive storm coming in or a very unstable storm coming in. But I don't think that we have enough of these conversations to say, hey, what if you are out there doing it as routine maintenance several days before the storm? What impact does that actually have on the area? What impact does it have on the soil hydrology? What impact does it have on feedback cycles? Will it only make an unstable storm even stronger? And those are the conversations that we miss because people are too afraid to talk about it, because there are still too many people out there who dismiss it. There are people out there, believe it or not, who still think that weather modification isn't a real thing. It's been around for ages. It was actually designed as a weapon and used as a weapon in World War II. But yet there are people who still believe, because they've been told every time somebody brings it up, oh, that's a conspiracy theory, that it doesn't exist. And because of that, we don't ask enough questions about it. Because of that, there's not enough scientific research. There's not enough people. There's more people investing money into additional weather modification. There are people investing money into seeing the complications of it. And I'm sorry, but anytime you mess with nature, there are complications. There are repercussions. If you haven't checked out those stories, I definitely would. I think that these are conversations that everybody should be having, especially right now. What we should be doing is trying to figure out how to put systems in place, alarm systems in place, management policies and regulations in place that could prevent another situation like this from happening. Because what happened was just terrifying and dreadful. And like I said, I was in disbelief when I first read about it. And as the numbers have continued to climb, I'm sure we're going to be over 150 by the time this is all done, or around 150. I don't know. There are some reports that say it's worse than officials are telling us, but just going off of what we do know, going off of what we've seen out there, there are conversations that have to be had, even in the wake of something as difficult as a tragedy like this. These are conversations that people have to stand up and start having. And like I said, you know, in my perspective, we shouldn't even be modifying, we shouldn't be doing the things that we're doing. If it didn't exist, people wouldn't have all the conspiracy theories. But it does exist. And if it's going to exist, the difficult conversations need to exist. The re-examination needs to exist. The investigations into it need to happen. Not to get anybody in trouble, but to better understand how this stuff occurs. Because this is a storm, mind you, that only a couple inches could have changed how drastic the impacts of this were. And like I said, a feedback cycle, just something different in the atmosphere could have made a difference, a very small difference, 10, 15%, could have made a difference in the amount of rainfall in that area. It's not unfathomable in science, and therefore it has to be investigated. Anyway, guys, Stay tuned. I have more topics for you here on UNASA TV, but I wanted to get that off of my chest and why I published those articles and why I think this is such an important detrimental conversation.